Hello, everyone, and welcome to a great hour of conversation with Ann Hiatt, author of the book, Bet on Yourself. Ann is a proud graduate of the University of Washington. She has worked directly with Jeff Bezos of Amazon and also worked with top executives from Yahoo and Google before starting her own consulting firm. She empowers entrepreneurs and executives to develop a culture of relentless vision for long-term success. Today, she shares her experience and talks about her first book, Bet on Yourself. Ann, welcome. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you, Randy. This is such a pleasure to be back chatting with my alma mater and beyond. It's really a full circle moment for me. So thanks for having me.
Well, congratulations on your first book. And would you like to tell us a little bit of your story and what did you study at the UW? What was your student experience like? And how did it prepare you for the career that was ahead of you?
I had a great experience at UW. So I grew up in Redmond, Washington. My early life was as a military family. My dad was in the Air Force. But when I was about 10, we moved to Redmond. And so going to UW felt like the natural next step after I graduated from Redmond High School. And I studied international studies, focusing on Europe. And I ended up graduating with 2 bachelor's degrees, one in international studies and one in Swedish, which is a whole nother story. So my original plan was to be a professor. That had been my dream job from the time I was really small. I thought it sounded like so much fun to be able to read and write books for a living. But it turned out the universe had another plan for me.
So I have to ask this because it's in your book and it's just so cool. Your dad is kind of famous, kind of a cultural icon. Can you just touch on that and tell us how?
In the least expected way possible, yes. He's sort of a pseudo celebrity. So as I mentioned, I come from a military family. I was actually born on MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. My dad had just finished pilot training, and he was assigned to fly F-4 Phantom fighter jets, which was the ultimate dream for him. He grew up on a farm. In fact, I am first generation non-farmer in my entire family. But he decided that he wanted a different path for his life, so he joined the military. After I was born, we moved to Alaska, and my next 2 sisters were born on base there. And while they were there, a film studio was writing a script for a movie and asked if they could have access to cockpit recordings of my dad's flight squadron. And that movie became Top Gun. My dad's flight call sign is Goose, and I grew up next door to and going to Christmas parties with Maverick, Iceman, the whole cast of characters.
Wow, so that's really, really cool. So how did you end up working for Amazon and Google in the early 2000s?
So unexpected in every possible way. So I graduated in 2002, and we all remember that was just after the dot-com bust. And because Seattle is such a tech-heavy economy, a lot of the job opportunities disappeared seemingly overnight. So in anticipation of graduating, I had sent out at least 50 resumes before I even graduated and didn't get a single call back. And I was working on campus. Well, I had 2 on-campus jobs. One was at the European Union Center as part of the European Studies program. And the second was at Suzzallo Library. But the director of the EU Center, he asked me what my plans were after graduation, and I shared with him no one was calling back. And he just, almost as an aside, said, well, have you thought about applying at Amazon? I think his wife worked in recruiting there. That is literally the only reason, with a shrug, I applied at Amazon at all. I had no intention of going into technology. I was very interested in economies. So there was a business angle to my studies, absolutely. But I had never thought about doing that within tech. Again, this is back as this is being invented, so it's not such an obvious choice as it is now. I put in my resume, and they were literally the first company to call me back after, at that point, it was like 100 resumes had gone out. And it's a really long process. It took 9 months for me to get hired, but on the 3rd round of interviews, my last interview was with Jeff Bezos himself, and at the end of that interview, He hired me.
So that brings me right to my next question. 100 resumes, 9 months. One of the things you say in your book is building resilience is the greatest single skill needed to survive in competitive environments.
Yeah.
So you certainly exemplify that. Another thing, this is something that you're the only person who this has ever happened to, but you state in your book, you almost killed Jeff Bezos now. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I did almost kill Jeff Bezos. So I got hired. Anyone who wants to hear the long version of how to get Jeff Bezos to hire you, definitely read that section of the book. But once I was in the door, I think naivete definitely paid off for me in the interview process, because they didn't fully appreciate the enormous challenges that would be ahead of me if I got this job. I had never worked in that type of environment before. I didn't know anything about technology, and I sure didn't know how to be helpful to one of the world's most innovative entrepreneurs. But once I was there, my very first project that Jeff gave me was actually a logistics project. And he had a couple of properties he wanted to visit in Texas. And he just dropped this paper on my desk one day, and it had a long series of numbers on it. And he said, I want to go there next week. I've got Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And off he went. I looked at this paper and I was like, what is this? Because it wasn't addresses, but I figured out it was GPS coordinates, which I thought was strange, but okay. So I plotted out where they were. And again, this is pre-Google Maps. So it actually wasn't that easy to figure out where all these properties were and how far apart they were and the logistics of it. And they were just giant plots of land. That's why he had given me GPS coordinates. He was looking at buying big ranches. And so I mapped it out and I figured out how far apart they were and time needed to travel between. And I went to my manager, John, and I said, John, it's literally impossible to do this. To visit all these properties, I either need more time, we need to add a day to this trip, or we need to narrow it down a little bit. And John didn't even look up. He was just like, well, no is not an answer. You know, when Jeff wants something, you figure out how to get it done. And so I went back to my desk kind of sheepishly. And, you know, I'm like 21. I never had a project like this before. So I'm thinking, how do I solve this problem? And I was like, okay, we can't move the jet that we have chartered for this trip any closer. There's no other runways, and it's too far to drive. So eventually I came up with the proposal of hiring a helicopter. John approved that. He said, sure, go do that. And then again was like, I don't know how, I have never hired a helicopter ever in my life at that point. I didn't have anyone in my Rolodex, but I went to the charter company, went through the whole security procedures, hired my first helicopter, and off Jeff went to middle of nowhere, West Texas. He came back from that first trip like a kid on Christmas morning. He loved it. And I didn't know, and nobody knew what he was doing in Texas at that point. He came back and he was like, I'm really excited. I've narrowed it down to like 2 favorite properties. I want to go back next week, visit them, and decide which one I want to buy. And at this point, I'm feeling like, great, I've got a helicopter guy. I know how to work the logistics of this. I'm a little more confident. So I planned that second trip and off he went. Now, by this point in my job, this is only about 4 months into me working at Amazon, I had realized how underqualified I was for this job. There was a big learning curve ahead of me. So I had a notebook on my desk, and during the day, when people would use acronyms I didn't understand, or terminology I wasn't familiar with, or the names of experts and these big cast of characters that were circling around us, I would keep a list of all the things I didn't understand. And then I would come in with my university training. I would do my self-imposed homework every morning. So I would come in before anyone else and just search and read and digest as much information as I could to try and keep pace. So it was on an early morning like that, when it was only me and security in the building, when I got a phone call on my desk phone. And it was the charter pilots, and they had never called me before. So it was super strange already. And when I answered, they said, Anne, we don't want to alarm you. So of course I'm instantly alarmed. And they say, we've been filing the paperwork for the return flight tomorrow, and we heard an emergency beacon go off. There's been a helicopter crash in the area. My hands start shaking so bad I cannot hold a pen. And I just think to myself, I might have just killed Jeff Bezos. And again, this is actually just a month or so into 2003. At that point, Amazon had not yet had a profitable year. In fact, it only had one single profitable quarter so far. So all the valuation of the entire company is based on faith in Jeff Bezos. And I might have just killed him. And not only him, but the entire company would go down with it. because again, most investments had disappeared in that dot-com bust, and investment in Amazon and faith in Jeff for most of our shareholders, if not all, that was their only investment left standing. So I felt the enormity of that responsibility in that moment. So I had to pull myself together and decide, okay, what do you do when you might have killed Jeff Bezos and the entire company that I now work for? And so I called my manager, John, and I said, I think we need to assemble an emergency board meeting. Be prepared if it is him, if it isn't him, if he's dead, if he's seriously injured, if it's, all possible scenarios. John said, okay, do that. He started racing into work. And in the meantime, while we were gathering all the board of directors onto a call, I started calling hospitals to find out. I didn't know if it was him. So I did that without using his name, because again, I don't want to create a press story if there isn't one and affect stock value that way. And also, again, this is before Google Maps. So it was actually really hard for me to figure out what hospitals a helicopter crash victim might have been taken to. So I start calling hospitals, and at first I received some confused reactions when I call, but eventually I find one that when I ask, have you had anyone come in from a helicopter crash, instead of confused silence, they asked me if I was family. So I had found him. And while this was by far the worst day of my professional life, and knock on wood, I hope it stays that way. But I'm really glad it happened, actually, because two really important things happened after that. So once I found Jeff, it was him. He had crashed in that helicopter that I had hired for him. We patched him into the board of directors, and he talked them out of doing anything proactive, because what no one knew at the time was he was in Texas buying the property for what is now Blue Origin, his private space tourism company. He was entering the space race along with those original cast of characters like Elon Musk, who were competing for the Ansari X Prize. And he did not want them to know that he was getting started on his own quest. So he said, please don't issue any proactive statements. And actually, the only reason I can tell this story now is because eventually a reporter who was working on a story about the space race figured out what Jeff was doing. So it's common knowledge. But he said, okay, don't do anything. I'll be back. Everything's fine. And then he asked to talk to me. And I thought he was going to fire me. I thought nearly killing him was a fireable offense. Totally got that. But instead, he said to me some of the nicest words anyone's ever said to me professionally. He just said, Anne, I hear you're really good under pressure. And he might have said something after that. I think I totally blacked out. I was like so relieved, one, that he was alive and he was okay, and two, that he wasn't upset with me. And that moment changed two things. One, it changed the way that Jeff Bezos saw me. He no longer saw me as the junior most person in the company who had no idea what she was doing and probably no business having the job I had, which was basically true. But it shifted that thinking of being like, I could be trusted. I was a resource to be utilized, and I could join these crazy dreamers in doing things that none of us had ever done before. And probably more importantly than that was I now saw myself that way, even though pretty much every task I was given from that day forward, I had no idea how to do well. I had never done it before. I trusted myself to ask the right questions, gather the right team of experts, analyze the data, and pivot and try again as necessary. And the great thing about that environment of the early 2000s was that even though I was the junior most person in the company, that kind of risk-taking and behavior was being modeled for me by the senior most members of our team. The SVPs who were working directly for Jeff were also doing things on a daily basis they didn't know how to do because they were inventing the future of e-commerce. And so it was a safe place for me to learn that. Look, I'm a natural perfectionist in all the negative ways. All the ways that hold you back and make you timid and want to just blend into the corner and hope no one notices you. That's my nature. But because of that horrible helicopter crash experience and that environment that I was raised in, they kind of nurtured me out of that behavior and sort of forced me into the deep end of the pool. So in the end, I'm actually really glad it happened, even though my palms still sweat every time I tell that story.
Oh, I'm sure they do. And just as a side note, I might add from your book, I learned that, and everyone should know, Mr. Bezos proved himself to be heroic on that day because while wounded himself, he was clearing other seriously injured people and helping them. And it certainly shows a lot about his character that a lot of people don't know.
Absolutely. He was completely the hero that day. Eventually, once the story broke and there were these articles, it got picked up. Of course, people thought that was fascinating. It was at least 9 months later, if not a year later. I think it was Business Insider. Oh gosh, I wish I could remember which publication it was. But they posted this photo. The cover image for the story about Jeff's helicopter crash was some kind of like superhero from some kind of action movie with Jeff's head cut and paste on top of the actor's body. And it's like this really cool like guy emerging from the flames, and he's got the leather jacket and the aviators. And it makes me laugh now to see him actually dressing that way. I wonder if the look was inspired by that article that was written. But yeah, he was very brave. He was slightly injured in the crash. He pulled out the pilot. He pulled out the ranch owner who had broken his collarbone in the crash, who was on top of Jeff's personal assistant. And Jeff is not a large man, but that adrenaline allowed him to single-handedly save everyone on board and be able to climb up the hill behind them and use the satellite phone I had insisted he take to call for help. He was absolutely a hero. Yeah.
Wow. And you know what? I just have to add something here. I forgot to say this in the beginning, but there's something I just have, an announcement that this event is being recorded and will be played back on our YouTube channel. And we'll be showing the link for Anne's book in the chat. So after this discussion, there will be a chance for question Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A field at any time during the talk, and we will ask them at the end. And so, Mr. Bezos, if you want to, ask a question, we'd love to hear from you. Not only looking at that situation, not only did you get fired, but you found out a decade later that he was very, very sad to see you go, and maybe even he perceived that you were going to a competitor, which was very difficult. How you are a risk taker, and I know a lot of us have bosses that we actually like, and so that makes it very hard to leave a job. But you believe that you are going to create your own dreams, isn't that right?
It was really gut-wrenching. And even now, my dad still asks me occasionally like about some of my non-linear career pivots. It's true. After 3 years at Amazon, so I was there from 2002 through 2005, I did leave because I got into my dream program at UC Berkeley. In fact, in my interview, Jeff only asked me 2 questions. The first was a brain teaser, and the second was, tell me about your career aspirations. And because that was part of our first conversation ever, it wasn't a huge surprise to him when I was applying. I asked him to write a letter of recommendation for me, which he did. But what we didn't expect was I got into my dream program on my very first application. Because with PhDs, as you know, it's all about timing. Is there an opening in the department? Are they looking at the focus of what you want to study on? So I thought that would take a couple of years to work out. But then suddenly I got in and I had to make that really hard decision to leave. I was beyond shocked when many years later, a friend of mine from Amazon was in town in California after I had moved to California to do my PhD program. Just a year and a half in, Google came recruiting. It was another gut-wrenching pivot moment for me to leave my PhD and go to Google. And yeah, it was shocking to me to hear that when Jeff found that out, that I had gone to work at Google, he was really upset about that. Like, he was happy to lose me to academia, but he was not happy to lose me to work at Google, which he viewed as a competitor. So it really hurts my heart. I think you're making an excellent point, and I think this is something that not enough people think about, is that loyalty factor. In fact, this came back to me 3 years into my career at Google. I had to do that again. I had to leave an executive that I really cared about. I learned so much from her. My first manager was Marissa Meyer at Google. She at the time was vice president of search products and user experience at Google, which is a long, fancy title that meant we got to make really cool things. We were running product team. We were doing constant big launches. Other teams got to figure out how to monetize it, but that was our job. And I made a gut-wrenching decision to leave her, even though I really admired her and learned a lot, to go work for Eric Schmidt, the CEO. In these moments, you really do have to separate your own ambitions from feelings of loyalty. So this is in retrospect. It was not this clear in my brain at the time I was making these really hard decisions. But in retrospect, I can see that what gave me the courage to make these really hard decisions when, it makes me sound so brave and like, whatever, I know I have a plan. I'm not like that. But when I look back, here's 3 things I use to evaluate my career opportunities. The first is, am I learning the expertise I want to be known for in the future? Like, I am an insatiable worker. I will outwork and outcare anyone on my team. But what I want in return is I want to learn a lot really fast. And so as soon as I feel that itch of being like, oh, gosh, I feel underutilized, or I kind of feel like everything's rinse and repeat, that's a little signal to me. I get restless and I look out for that next challenge. The second thing is that I always want to work for a leader that I not only like and enjoy, but that I want to become like. And that's the tricky part, because one of the greatest gifts that the universe has ever given me is working for these incredible leaders. They are people that even if I sat at their side for 50 years straight, I would learn new things. But it's just one element of many that we need to consider in career choices. So that's the second. I'm very lucky I always worked for leaders I wanted to become like. But the third element is disruption. That's the third thing I always need for career happiness. And that doesn't necessarily mean like disruptive technologies. That means, am I disrupting myself? Am I learning new things? Am I being challenged? Am I getting outside of my comfort zone? Is the team I'm on disruptive? Do they shake up their best practices and are willing to try something new? Are they innovative in their approach to work? Are they attracting new minds from different backgrounds and really seeking out the diversity of thought? So when one of these 3 things is no longer true for me, that's when I start considering like maybe it's now time to seek out a new challenge. And when 2 of the 3 are true, it is time to go. And I know it sounds so brave when you just break it down into a 1, 2, and 3, but it is gut wrenching. And I don't want to make light of these really hard decisions, but that is absolutely how you stay on the forefront and how we don't get burned out. If you're working that hard, this for me is the recipe for not burning out. Most of my career I've worked 15-hour days constantly. But for me, that made it feel like my job was filling me up and giving me as much back as I was giving to it.
And in fact, you state in your book that when you spend 80% of your day in the comfort zone, it's time to move on.
For me, that's the right balance. Yeah, I think not enough people do that audit of, especially now in the pandemic. Ironically, burnout is happening because everyone went into this like little ball and we kind of curled up into our comfort zone. I'm like, I'm just going to stay here and I'm going to do this. And I'm not going to make waves because everything else is crazy. But that's actually a recipe for burnout. If you're underutilized, you're just doing the same things over and over again, and you're in your zone of genius and not pushing yourself out, that's when you burn out. So yeah, you want to seek out, for me, the right balance is 80-20. I like to live in my expertise for about 80% of my day. And 20%, which actually doesn't sound like that much, but it actually is. That's 1 day of your 5 days of your week outside your comfort zone, learning something new, doing something you've never done before. And for me, that's the right balance to keep me fresh and not prone to burnout, although it definitely happens to me too.
And in your book, you state that many, many people are unwilling to let go of unfulfilling jobs and relationships. Well, that was interesting, but jobs and relationships, they won't let go of them because they're familiar and less risky.
Yeah. The truth is, though, when we hold on to that familiar that no longer fulfills us, that's actually the riskiest place to be. You think you're building up this zone of security, but you are primed then to be disrupted. You're kind of giving someone else control rather than seeking it out proactively on your side. So I think that is, all these things, conversations we're having right now about the Great Resignation, I think there's a lot of elements here where you think you're in your safety zone, but you're actually, we feel unsettled because we've actually taken a back seat and we're no longer in the driver's seat. When you put yourself back in that, even if you're taking some big risks, it feels better because at least it was a decision made by you instead of some outside force.
One thing you state is don't rest on your old laurels. No matter how much your job might bring you some status, And you use your dad as an example. You want
Mhm.
to just tell us about, how your dad went from being a hotshot, Maverick and Goose fighter pilot to what?
Yeah,
Why?
he absolutely modeled this for me. Both of my parents were incredible innovators because in military life, there's so much outside of your control. But my dad, yeah, he had left the farm life. He did something no one he knew had ever done before, which is not only learn to fly a plane, but become an elite fighter pilot. So this is a big dream that statistically was so unlikely it never should have happened. But he did that. But then he felt this unsettled feeling. While he was living his dream, his family was away from him. He would be on flight on these missions. We didn't even know where he was at the time because this is during the détente period of the Cold War. We didn't know where he was. He would be gone for 2-3 months at a time. In fact, in that early stages of my childhood, I think we had 3 Christmases in a row that he wasn't there. So we would celebrate it a month early or a month late. And my parents thought we wouldn't notice because, we were tiny. We were like, I think I was 5, 3, and 2 or something were the ages of the kids of the family. So yeah, it was a big, but he was living his dream. But there was this point where he was like, I need to move on from this. I need time with my family. So yeah, he made the hard decision and left the military, which he loved, and went to law school. So he invented himself for a third time. And in law school, I was used to my entire childhood when my dad came into a room, people would stand up and salute. But then when he went to law school, he was doing full-time studies and working at night as a janitor just to pay the bills and keep food on the table. And that as a child, I didn't fully appreciate what that experience must have been like for him, but he was willing to step back from the seeming grandeur of his first dream and reinvest and reinvent himself so that he could create the life for us that he thought would be most fulfilling. And obviously the ripple of the effect of that has changed my entire career because he ended up his first job after law school was in Seattle. And because my parents are from farms, they didn't want to live in the big city, which is so adorable because Seattle's not that big of a big city. But that's why they settled in Redmond, Washington, which changed the course of my life because there they could have a big garden and our neighbors had horses. Can you imagine, those of you who know Redmond now, like it's like Microsoft is everywhere. But when we originally moved there, it was a little bit their comfort zone. So I've reflected on my dad's example many times when making those seemingly non-linear job descriptions or job changes. And I've now started to think of it kind of like a springboard. When you think about if you're trying to dive from a pool deck, if you're firmly on the concrete edge, there's only so far you can launch yourself. But if you take a running leap down towards the end of a springboard and push purposely downward, it's actually that creates the kinetic energy that allows you to go much higher and further than you alone could possibly do. But you can't skip that downward push. And I think whenever I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm taking 2 steps backwards and I want to be going forwards, it's that investment before it pays off in the long run. So I like to think of him in that analogy when I have those moments of terror of like, what have I done?
You talk a lot in your book about pivots in your life that sometimes they're expected, sometimes they're not. You had a dream your entire life of becoming a professor.
Yeah.
And while studying for your PhD at Berkeley, you got an offer from Google and you state about your decision, quote, "My heart was clear, but my head wasn't ready to acknowledge it." So your emotions and your logic are at war with each other. Can you tell us about that moment?
Yeah, that was so gut-wrenching. Even when I look back now, I'm like, how was I brave enough to do that? Because I had left a job. I had left Amazon and Jeff Bezos just as it was becoming profitable. That was not just a flippant decision. That was I knew that company was a rocket ship blasting off to space, and I just gave up my seat. I knew that when I left. And so having made that kind of sacrifice to bet on myself and my dream, and then to leave it, just early in my PhD studies felt so insane. But there was something in my heart that really was very clear from the earliest stages. And it was actually by clever design of a recruiter. I had declined requests to interview despite his heavy recruiting attempts. But he eventually got me to say yes and come to campus. And he was like, well, surely you want a tour. You've probably heard about, the perks and stuff. And he was right. Like everyone knows that, you get free food and you can bring your dog to work and there's all this, perks and free stuff. So I did want to see it. But it was then during that tour that I got the dose of courage I needed to make this decision. It was because of the people I experienced there. It actually had nothing to do with those perks. And even now, I left Google 3.5 years ago. Now people ask me, oh, do you miss it? Because I was there for 12 years. That's my family. That's my comfort zone. And it's true, I do miss it. But again, it's the people. I don't even think about the perks. I don't even think about the free food. I think about the people that I miss the most. But yeah, I know it sounds very brave, but it was gut wrenching. I'm not an emotional person. It takes a lot to make me cry. And I had many tearful nights trying to make that decision. But I took the leap because my heart was so clear that this was my new tribe. These were my people.
Wow, that's great. And you talk about when you were starting out, you thought the way to get ahead was working 130-hour weeks,
Yeah, I don't
130-hour work weeks, no lunch breaks.
No.
And looking back on that, what would you change, or how have you changed from those days of those huge weeks?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on this a lot recently. So I have two reactions to that. One was that even though, and I share this example in the book, even though it's kind of crazy working that many hours for that long, it's insane. In fact, my parents got really worried, and my mom, I remember having a conversation with me, asking me like, how are you not burning out? Like, this is not healthy. You need a better life balance. I was still really young. I was in my mid to late 20s. And she was very concerned about this lack of work-life balance. But I said to her in complete surprise, well, quite seriously, I was like, that is just not how I experience it. It didn't burn me out because I felt so passion and mission aligned with what we were trying to do. Again, this goes back to like making sure your job gives as much to you as you're giving to it. I was giving a lot, but I was going back to that checklist. I was learning so much. I was learning the expertise I wanted to eventually be known for. I was working for leaders. I was like, I will never find this group, not only one leader, but so many in one place. And I just wanted to soak up every second. And it was so disruptive. Like every day we were launching something that we knew was going to change the world. And so nobody asked me to work that many hours. I just didn't want to miss it. I didn't want to be the one who didn't come in on that Saturday when we solved that huge problem and fixed the code red that we were on, or preparing for that big launch event. Like I was so mission aligned that it just sweeps you up. It gives you that energy rather than draining it. So that's an energy exchange I'm very mindful of now in my work. And then the second thing is I was working in the earliest years of Google for Marissa Meyer, as I mentioned, and she has this incredible tool for managing her team and not burning them out that I think of now that I'm a founder myself and an employer. She calls it finding your rhythm. In the book, I share the story of when she had this light bulb moment of how to not burn out her team while we were working these insane hours. And Marissa went to one of her most talented project management engineers. Her name was Johanna. And she was really worried about Johanna. Johanna had 2 young children under the age of 3, and she was in charge of our expansion into India, which was very strategic for the growth of the entire company. But that meant that Johanna needed to be on video conferences at 2 a.m, like every day. And she was really worried. And so she went to Johanna, like, how can I protect you? Do I need to pull you off this project? And Johanna said, please don't pull me off of the project. I am so proud to be working on something that's so closely tied to the success of the company, because Google wasn't yet the dominant search engine yet. We were at number 3 at the time. So I know it's hard to imagine now, but we were fighting for our lives. And it was very important that we had this expansion. Johanna said, but you know what would really help me is if I was sure to be home every day for bath time and bedtime with my kids. If I'm always there and I get that protected time with them, I don't mind. In fact, I'm happy to get on video calls at 2 a.m. And so Marissa was like, oh my gosh, okay, that's your rhythm. That's what fills you back up so you can continue to give. So she went to every single one of her direct reports and asked them the same question. What do you need to fill yourself back up so that you can continue to work at this pace? And, we didn't have to do that forever, but it was quite a few more years that we did. And so for each person, it was different. Like for one engineer on our team, he really didn't want to miss his Friday night soccer match with his friends from college. If that was protected, he got to do that every week. He didn't care about working on Saturday. He loved it. And so for each of us, it was a different rhythm. And I find that not enough of us ask ourselves that question of like, what do I need to protect in my life that will fill me back up so I can continue to give? And I know if those of you who have had lockdown with small kids and sharing, your home workspace, that might be 35 seconds of your day that you feel like you're in charge of. But we need to be really purposeful with that. And I think about this especially when resources are limited like that, and especially when it's our time. I think of Pareto's principle or the 80-20 rule. We actually find when we look at our time, you'll find that 80% of your results come from 20% of your efforts. So if you can only be in charge of 20% of your efforts, you actually can get a huge return when you're really purposeful about that time. So I think this is one of the things that's been most helpful to me in the pandemic. And I absolutely have experienced the anxiety, the overwhelm, the paralysis that we all have. But when I find myself in that zone of panic, asking myself that question, what do I need to fill myself back up so I can continue to give today? It really shifts the balance of that energy.
And you talk about the power of rituals, in your hour in the morning of regeneration and getting that prepared for the day.
Mm-hmm. Rituals are really important. So I learned this first from Jeff Bezos. So he has a habit of once a quarter spending an entire week in what he calls a thinking retreat. Now for Jeff, he has a particular formula. So for him, it's going to a hotel. Often it was very close to our office and his home, but he would lock himself away there with no outside stimulus, no newspapers, phone, conversations, like literally nothing. He would spend the first days just clearing his mind of the clutter. And then he would bring these blank Moleskine notebooks. And by the end of it, they were full of free-flowing ideas and just anything would pop into his mind, because you really have to kind of allow yourself to get bored for a lot of this innovative thinking, this forward thinking, or even to see maybe common threads in problems you're experiencing. That comes to the forefront when we allow ourselves to get bored. Goodness knows how many of us let ourselves get bored anymore. We just pick up the phone and we start scrolling. But Jeff really taught me that moment, like, as I love how you phrase it, of these rituals, that when we protect this and give ourselves the task of just clearing your mind with the purpose of being creative and seeing what comes up, amazing things happen. Now, when I worked for Eric Schmidt, he did this very differently, but to the same end. So his ritual was doing what we called listening tours. So we first did this together when he transitioned from being CEO into executive chairman. He had never been a full-time chairman before, and Google never had a full-time chairman before. So we had to write his job description. We had to decide, what are the major deliverables? What does the company need from him? And how can he serve our users out in the world? And so we decided we didn't know. It would be disingenuous to write something. So we spent almost the first full year of his chairmanship out in the world. We visited like 50 global offices. We met with Nobel Prize winning scientists and artists and the smartest people in the world who had expertise that Eric didn't himself have. And we just kept our ears open for patterns and ways that we could be of service. And so while when we're in our careers, we don't have that control, right? I can't say, I'm taking a week off every quarter and I'm going to just think, that's not within our controls. But the way I translated that into my own work was, as you mentioned, I would protect 1 hour every morning. For me, the way I fill myself back up is one, through physical movement. Like I want to go on a hike or go to the gym or go for a run, because that's the only time I can kind of turn my brain off. It's kind of spinning all the time. And then, and I also like to learn. So I like to listen to a podcast while I'm running or read a news article in the morning. And so when I do that and I protect it, that's why I have to do it first thing, because otherwise I can get steamrolled. But when I do that, I have so much more to give. My whole career has been about serving other people. And I can't do that if I have drained myself to empty and not been purposeful about how to fill myself up. But again, the way you might fill yourself up could completely be different than that. But being purposeful and making sure you seek it out is the most important part.
So I just want to touch on something you mentioned earlier. And you're from the University of Washington, and we're very proud of having you as a UW grad. I'm also an alumni from UW. But you didn't always see that as a strength, though, because in your book, you talk about being surrounded people with elite backgrounds, elite education. You were oftentimes the only person in a room without a degree from Stanford or Princeton.
Yep.
And this made you self-conscious for many years. How did you deal with that? And what did you do to get over that?
That took a long time. I mean, even now, we're all susceptible to imposter syndrome, but it was tough because especially early years of Google, actually, they wouldn't, it was a qualifier to even apply. You had to have gone to a top 10 university. The only reason the recruiter came after me was because I went to Berkeley for grad school. That's ridiculous. And thankfully, they realized the error and the limiting workforce that they can recruit with that. So thankfully, they saw the error of their ways. But in the early days, I literally was one of the only people who didn't spend my entire life in private school. So yeah, I felt like I had to apologize for that. I felt like I had to start every conversation being like, oh, I went to Berkeley, which is insane. Like the way I became this scrappy, incredible, forward-thinking person is because of my entire history, is because I came from farmers, is because I went to UW and I studied this emerging economy, which was the euro that launched the same year I graduated from UW. It's because of all those experiences that I had the ability to think quickly on my feet when that helicopter crashed, or, to have the bravery to try something brand new because I'd seen that modeled. All of that actually is what qualified me to have a seat at that table. And I would like to think that if through that experience, they realized they needed more diverse backgrounds, whether it's socioeconomic or, all the definitions of diversity. That is what qualifies you to be at those tables, because you are the one who can contribute a voice that no one else can. It took me a long time to see that as a value add, but once I did, it unlocked everything, because I stopped holding myself back and I stopped apologizing for not having that, what I thought was elite qualifications to be there. I felt like I always had to outwork everyone else just to keep, and maybe that is a bonus. Actually, it served me pretty well having that imposter syndrome for a while. But yeah, that's insane. My upbringing, my education, all of it is a huge part of why I was successful. I don't think I could have had that kind of grit, had I had some traditional entry point into early tech.
And you've seen imposter syndrome in top people. You've seen it firsthand. So it's not just you or me. It's everybody at some points in their, in their low periods.
Yeah. I really, this surprised me so much. So I had seen this many times. I had seen so many of these executives, I know the 1.0 version of Jeff Bezos. I know he's now the wealthiest, most powerful, well-known person in the entire world. But that's not the Jeff I worked for. The Jeff I worked for was just figuring it out. He was working insanely hard. He had this vision that no one else did. He's always been exceptional. But he was figuring it out. And me watching him figure that out and be part of that process inspired me. Then eventually, when I was working for Eric Schmidt, he had been CEO of 2 companies before being recruited to be CEO of Google by the founders. I worked for him for 9.5 of the 12 years that I worked at Google. But it was actually towards the end of our time there that we had this really salient moment together that I share in the book. I think it was 2017. Eric was giving the major keynote at the tech conference in Paris called Vivatech. He was the speaker immediately before the newly elected president of France, Emmanuel Macron. And Eric looked a little nervous before going on stage, which was so unusual. He speaks on huge stages every single day. But it was a brand new speech. It was about artificial intelligence. This was probably the first speech on a major tech stage where they were talking about AI. It had only been talked about in research institutions up until that point. So he was introducing it to the world. This is how it became a conversation around dinner tables. And so I was like, okay, maybe it's just because the material is new and it's a new concept, and he felt a responsibility to do justice to it. And I standing off stage, I always had my notebook and I was keeping notes of okay, this part of the speech worked well. We need more examples here. Ooh, he told that joke. That did not land. Let's never tell that joke again. That's the kind of feedback he would ask of me when he came off stage, always. But when he came off stage, he turned to me and asked with such sincerity, he said, "Anne, was that okay?" And I put my little notebook down. I looked him in the eyes. And I was like, "You're Eric Schmidt." Like, of course that was okay. And he just got quiet and he was like, I still sometimes have to remind myself I'm not little Eric from Virginia anymore. And I have repeated that to myself as a mantra so many times when I feel underqualified to be at a table I'm sitting at now, or now saying I'm a #1 bestselling author. I have to say, Anne, you are not little Anne from Redmond anymore. Like, allow yourself to evolve from that original Anne 1.0. And when we have those moments of discomfort, I think we're actually just having moments of realization of how far we've come. That little Anne from Redmond has done things she never even was brave enough to dream. And so I think that's where it comes from. And I also really appreciate, there's a social scientist, I can't remember her name, but she reframed imposter syndrome as imposter moments. I love this reframing because instead of considering it a lifetime permanent diagnosis or syndrome, she's like, if you feel that and you frame it as, oh, I'm having an imposter moment, then you can say, thank you for reminding me how far I've come and that I've earned my keep here, and off you go. I use that all the time. It's like an easy button of getting over it, being like, it's a moment, it's a little imposter moment, off we go. And if Eric Schmidt himself still has those little moments, sure, it's fine for us.
So when I hear the word perfectionist, I think of a good thing, right? If a musician is a perfectionist or a carpenter, so you just want to hire that person. You don't think it's necessarily a positive thing all the time. Can you talk about perfectionism and how it's affected you?
Yeah, I was born a perfectionist. I always held myself to a much higher standard than my parents even ever would. I wanted to get the 10 out of 10 every time. And that was a negative for me in that it would hold me back from trying things that I didn't think I could do perfectly. I wouldn't even try it because I was like, oof, this is going to be a 6 out of 10. That's going to be embarrassing. I don't want to set myself up for embarrassment, so I'm not going to do it. Had I stayed in that perfectionist zone, I would have missed out on the greatest joys of my entire life. And the price of getting to those greatest joys in my life was constantly getting a 6 out of 10, trying again, then a 7, then an 8, then a 9. It's that progression that has served me well. And there's some great research work around this. Adam Grant in particular talks a lot about the downsides of perfectionism. It also served me well because I had this complex. It did make me willing to outwork my peers at school and outcare, everyone on my team. So it did light this fire in me that I eventually used for good. But if I had stayed in that zone of not being willing to take some risks and to fail, it would have been really bad. In fact, I learned that from Marissa Meyer. Marissa is a very much like a throw you in the deep end of the pool kind of a leader. She was like, you'll figure it out. I trust you. You're a smart person. I hired you for a reason. She would just throw you in it. And she taught me that being ready to take on a new challenge doesn't equal being ready to do it perfectly. It just means you're ready to try, and that you can trust yourself to be smart enough to figure it out. I'm so grateful for that lesson.
I gotta tell you, it's 12:50 already, and I didn't realize it was getting so late. I want to get to questions. I do want to ask you one thing about the book. One last thing before we ask listener questions is, you talk about the power of letting go, and you said in 2017 you sold everything you owned, and all you had left were 2 suitcases and 3 duffel bags to your name. And then you moved to Spain.
I did.
Can you tell us about that very personal and important moment?
It is semi crazy. Like, this was absolutely the tail end of a midlife crisis for sure. My entire life had been upended. Things were very much in the air, and maybe others can relate to this. When so much is uprooted at the same time, maybe people watching this during the pandemic have had massive amounts of change at the same time. It was almost easier to fully uproot the few things that remained to reinvent myself than to struggle to just, feel planted with a single root remaining. So yeah, I literally sold, donated, got rid of everything I owned, my house, my car, art, clothes, everything. And I moved to Europe, and I was actually a nomad for like a year and a half before that was a socially acceptable thing to do. I lived in London, then I lived in New York, and then I eventually, I've settled here in Spain, which is where I am now. In fact, In a couple of weeks is my 4-year anniversary of moving to Spain. And I think when you're in environments that are so foreign to you, it gives you a bit more permission to experiment and reinvent yourself than when you're around people who already have expectations of you and how they want you to behave and what they're used to. So it was a little bit of my cheat to get over my personal midlife crisis and come here. It was the scariest thing I've ever done. It was gut-wrenching. I don't recommend it. It's not for the faint of heart, but by far one of the best things I've ever done.
You know, one thing you say that absolutely terrifies me is we are the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with.
Yeah.
If you knew my friends, you'd know why it would terrify me. But can you tell me a little bit about what you mean by that?
It's so funny that you pull that quote out, because I actually shared that on social media, but while I was considering adding it to the book. And my sister, who's just younger than me, she worked with me at Google, and then she works in blue chip tech companies still. She actually has 2 sets of twins under the age of 4. And she's been working from home and all the things. So whenever I think I'm tired, I think of her and I'm like, never mind. But so she reacted to my social media post about that. And she's like, well, okay, if I'm the average of the 5 people I spend the most time with, I'm 3 years old. So I think some of the parents out there might be like, well, but why I put that in the book was because the people we surround ourselves with, like, may or may not be under your control. If you have small children or whatever, or maybe your manager isn't the kind of person you want. But if we're purposeful about the people we surround ourselves with, if we're trying to be brave, if we surround ourselves with risk takers, it empowers you rather than people who are like, why are you doing that? Stop, get back in your box. So I find that tight influence, we can actually be much more purposeful and choosy about those 5 people than we think. But it doesn't happen without proactive behavior. Reactively, it's just going to be whoever's around you. But if we're really proactive at holding that bar really high, that can absolutely change your luck. And this is how you engineer serendipity for yourself, is the tribe you surround yourself with. And I feel very lucky to have been surrounded with some of the world's biggest dreamers, because they inspired me to do things who are far outside my nature.
So why did you write this book? And what is the one bit of advice you would like to share from your book?
I wrote this book because I felt a heavy responsibility to take this incredible apprenticeship that has been my career, all these lessons and best practices and experiences of these super performers, of Jeff Bezos and Eric Schmidt and Marissa Mayer and the many other brilliant CEOs I've worked with. And I want to give that to everyone. This book is very personal because I use my career as a case study, because I am not exceptional. I'm average. I'm just like you all. So I found that when I would share some of these best practices of these super performers I've worked for, people automatically opt out. They're like, I will never be Jeff Bezos, or I will never work at Google. That doesn't apply to me. And so I wanted to use my career as a case study to take these best practices and translate that into a playbook for us normal people that felt more approachable and inclusive, no matter where you're at in your personal journey. Look, I've had incredible luck and also terrible timing. I entered the workforce just after the dot-com bust, when options were limited. I was looking for my first big promotion in 2008 at Google, when that opportunity, that disappeared overnight with that economic crash. And then I finally got brave and I left Google after 12 years and founded my own consulting firm just a year before a global pandemic. Terrible timing. But I wanted everyone to see that there are ways that we can translate these best practices no matter what is happening around us or the career stage you're at. So what I hope people take away from this book is an understanding that sometimes counterintuitively, bigger risks actually are easier than the incremental tiny changes we're trying to make. If you make that big leap, it's often better received and easier to pull off than these teeny tiny little goals. And that's actually how I start the conclusion of the book, is sharing my skydiving experience, which I thought would be like the worst, most horrible experience of my life. But it turned out I didn't experience it as falling. It felt like flying, because the earth was so far away. It just never felt like it was getting closer. And I think that's a really good analogy for when we're trying to take some risks, and especially when it affects your self-identity. which my career pivots absolutely have many times.
Yeah, I loved reading your book because you're dreadfully honest in it, and you talk about the good and things that happen in your life that weren't so good. Maybe you talked about, a Milwaukee conference that didn't go so well for you, and how you rebounded from that and got stronger from it. So I very much enjoyed the book. You can get it here at the University Bookstore, and they are signed. So
I signed it myself just a couple weeks ago. Yeah. Oh, Randy, thank you so much for that. I do hope that not only am I sharing some of the things that worked really well and some of my wins, but I absolutely wanted to share some of the failures, because it's from that we really learned that we're not made of glass, that we can just bounce and try again. And I hope some of me sharing my honest journey inspires someone else to make a really big bet on themselves. This has been such a fun conversation.
And it's great to have you here. And one of the things you said that I wrote down, it was so poignant for me, is build your own dreams rather than get paid to build someone else's. Yeah. And I just love that.
Oh, thank you. That was actually my mantra to myself when I finally decided to leave Google. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to leave and become, a founder of something. You can do that even as an entrepreneur in your own job. You can, even when you're getting paid to do X, Y, and Z today, it's more of a mindset shift. Am I here because I'm in the driver's seat of what I want to learn, who I want to serve, and how I want to show up, or am I building someone else's dream? It's just, even if your job description doesn't change or your role doesn't change in your company, that decision puts you in the driver's seat of what you're contributing today, rather than feeling like you're getting paid to build someone else's dream. It's very empowering. I love that resonated with you.
We do have a quick question from Hannah before we go. And I know you talk about this in your book. So, Anne, do you know Spanish?
Sí, hablo español. Ahora sí. Antes no. Yeah, I speak Spanish now. When I moved here, I could only order a taco. That's it. But now, yeah.
Hannah also says, thank you. Great talk and very relatable. It's relatable for everybody, and you talk about, wherever you are in your life or your job, do it the best. And it's something that we can all relate to. So we really appreciate you and being here. Thank you for celebrating your new book, Bet on Yourself. And again, you can purchase signed copies here at the University Bookstore through our website. Thank you for joining us, and please check out our website, social media, or sign up for our emails to hear about our other upcoming virtual events. And thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here today. And thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.